we have underpinned demand. We have, I think, largely regulatory stability under this administration. They're not really any different to the predecessor. We have an aging population. So yeah, I think the medium to longer term outlook still feels very rosy for healthcare.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. I'm joined by Bellevue Healthcare Trust co-portfolio manager, Paul Major. Paul, very good to speak with you. Donald Trump and the Republicans made a clean sweep in last week's US election. Take us through the implications of a second Trump administration for the healthcare sector in the US.
Sure. I think that you have to think about this in kind of two ways. So the first question is healthcare versus the rest of the market, and then I think secondly, specific policies relating to healthcare. So as everybody will be aware, Trump's main policy point throughout the campaign has really been about putting America first from a trade perspective and imposing tariffs, which are clearly pro-inflationary. So whether or not his bark is much worse than his bite, we'll have to wait until early next year to find out. But I think it's probably reasonable, and the market's already assuming that the pathway, the trajectory of interest rates falling is probably going to be slower than it was because we're going to be in a world where there's inflationary pressure. And of course, everybody will be aware that that's the environment we've lived in from 2021 through to very recently. And healthcare, certain elements of healthcare did struggle against the wider market, particularly the less profitable bits or the bits where the value is very much in the future, because obviously you're discounting at a much higher rate. So I think at a headline level, you look at this initially and you think, this isn't good for healthcare. Maybe it's going to struggle a little bit, but then I think when you then reflect on it from a policy perspective, I think things get a little more interesting. So one of the overriding challenges of the Biden administration has been around M&A and antitrust. So we've had a very active Federal Trade Commission, lots of investigations into cases, lots of deciding not to accept proposed remedies and blocking transactions. And as I'm sure most of the viewers will be aware, licensing and acquisition of new products is the lifeblood of big pharma. So 1 in 3 drugs launched by pharmaceutical companies is invented by someone else, and they either acquire those drugs or they license them. And healthcare has been very much in the focus alongside technology for this iteration of the FTC under Biden and the leadership of this lady, Lina Khan. So that's going to change. And my personal view is that that's going to kick off a wave of larger scale M&A. So if you take a step back and you look at M&A during the Biden years, in total kind of value terms, it's been going on as before. But you've seen a lot more deals in the private sector, a lot more small deals. The big stuff hasn't happened because people have been fearful of FTC action. So I think that as the FTC appointees become clearer, you're going to see a lot more large-scale M&A, and that could actually, ironically, catalyse interest in the biotech sector, where M&A has always been a big part of investor returns. So, in as much as potentially higher long-term interest rates is a negative, I think the M&A side of things outweighs that as a positive. The other thing that's interesting, sorry, just about Trump in a broader sense, is that he's got a lot less policies around healthcare generally. So Trump version 1, he wanted to get rid of Obamacare and change all these entitlement programs of Social Security. This version of Trump is much more nuanced and less interested in wholesale policy reform. So in that sense as well, that kind of Trump overhang that we had in the first Trump presidency, my feeling is that won't come back in this second iteration.
Paul, you mentioned looking at the healthcare sector versus the broader market. So what does the outcome of the election mean for the relative performance of healthcare versus the broader market?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be at this stage hard to say because the pro-inflation nature of the tariffs is going to be really interesting. We know we live in a very interconnected world, in terms of supply chains, and China is a primary manufacturer of lots and lots of things in the chemicals and the electronics sector. And he said, disproportionately high tariffs for China and disproportionately high tariffs for any country that doesn't acquiesce to American foreign policy. So until we see what he actually imposes, you don't know the implications on supply chains. But as we've seen here in the UK, where you know, with our own budget, the national insurance for employers, and already companies are saying, yeah, we're going to have to pass this on in terms of higher prices to consumers because we can't afford to absorb all these additional costs. If you get tariffs, you're going to see the same thing. So I think so much depends for the wider market, so much depends on the impact on consumer sentiment from potentially higher prices. You know, lots of people say that's why Biden lost the election, because most Americans don't feel wealthier than they did in their pocket at the end of the week than they did 4 years ago. And in that sense, this could be disastrous for the American people. But on the other hand, he might not do, you know, he's Trump, he might not do half the things he says he's going to do. So I think in terms of healthcare, relative to everything else, I think we have a little bit more certainty. That may play very well. But the overall impact and the relative call, I think that's hard to make right now. But what I would say is the fundamentals of healthcare, you know, the demand side of it, the regulatory side of it. I don't think a Trump presidency and control of, as you rightly pointed out, you know, the whole of Congress. I don't think that creates any new worries that we weren't aware of.
You mentioned some subsectors being more vulnerable to inflation, but also more exposed to M&A. So are any of the subsectors in healthcare likely to benefit more from a Trump administration or do significantly worse?
Well, there are a couple to keep an eye on. So the two that most spring to mind, as I touched on, so biotechnology and big pharma. So big pharma needs biotech for new products. So if M&A comes back, that's good for pharma in the sense of comfort on securing future revenue streams, and for biotech investors in terms of takeout premium and all that side of things. There is a little bit of a sting in the tail. Many of you are probably aware that Trump's talked about appointing Robert Kennedy and a couple of other ladies to his healthcare team who have drawn parallels between basically conflicts of interest in healthcare driven by, you know, advertising on TV, generating demand, and all these sorts of things. So we may see some more tighter regulation of drug promotion. Now in the short term, I think that's probably good for margins, because I'm not sure how much all this TV advertising actually does to generate new business, and I don't know that it's going to affect kind of disease awareness advertising, which isn't branded by the name of a drug. It's kind of like, you know, if you've got these symptoms, talk to your doctor because there may now be something available when there wasn't before. That sort of stuff probably can continue, but in the longer term, you know, tighter regulation of promotion of pharmaceuticals might slow growth a little bit. So again, it's a nuanced kind of double-edged sword. But my feeling certainly is that the biggest near-term beneficiary will be the kind of biotech, you know, specialty pharma, the innovators in the drug space. They're the companies that have struggled relative valuation-wise over the last couple of years. And I think M&A could be a real pickup for sentiment, because lots of investors can sit there on the sidelines and say, well, I've not owned these things really in the last couple of years. It's not hurt my performance. What's the catalyst for me to look at them again? Well, the catalyst to look at them again is they're all being taken over on big premiums. So it could really engender a lot more interest in that sector of the market.
Paul, your overall thoughts for healthcare in the US going forward? Are you constructive on the sector?
I think we are. Though you know, we have demographics. We're less sensitive to consumer spending. So if you know, the consumer wallet does get hit by higher inflation, higher prices, higher interest rates on housing, all those sorts of things, that doesn't stop you being ill. And if you do get ill, you need to use the healthcare system. So we have underpinned demand. We have, I think, largely regulatory stability under this administration. They're not really any different to the predecessor. We have an aging population. So yeah, I think the medium to longer term outlook still feels very rosy for healthcare.
Well, I'm sure we're going to be chatting about this again in the future as Trump takes office next year. Thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
That's Bellevue Healthcare Trust Co-Portfolio Manager Paul Major.